it's an interesting story, actually. There was a University of the Arctic meeting in Maine in May, June of 2022. And at the meeting, there were a group of probably a dozen Indigenous youth from around the Arctic that were at the meeting, among the 100 or so participants in the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, the Indigenous youth invited all of the participants into a very large circle, and we were aligned chairs into the circle, and there were microphones that were passed around to the Indigenous youth, and they shared their observations from their discussions during the previous days. And everybody listened, and the Indigenous youth went one by one. Everybody participated, shared their observations, and at some point, the Indigenous youth invited others in the room to speak. So everybody was patient, respectful, and listened. And then there were various comments based on the observations of the Indigenous youth and interaction. So it became a discussion. And at one point, one of the Indigenous youth leaders in the room mentioned the concept, quote unquote, of a global Indigenous youth summit on climate change. And so I knew that it was possible to work with the United Nations Institute of Training and Research to convene these types of dialogues. I'm a senior fellow with UNITAR and have opportunity to suggest activities, initiatives that can be brought into the United Nations. And so this concept of a global Indigenous youth summit on climate change that was introduced at the University of the Arctic meeting in Maine made a lot of sense. I mean, the access to the United Nations, it seemed very tractable, something that I could imagine at that moment would be feasible to have a global Indigenous youth summit on climate change, hosted by the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. And so I raised my hand and said, yeah, let's do it. And that's where the journey began. But it began only in the sense that there was an idea introduced in Maine, because, as you can tell, I'm neither Indigenous nor youth. And so it wasn't something I could do by myself, and something that I could even initiate, really. And I mentioned it to UNITAR as a possibility, but it wasn't something that could happen until there were Indigenous youth that were leading this. And so the concept that became part of the discussion from the very beginning was that this global Indigenous youth summit on climate change would be by, for, and among Indigenous youth. So it couldn't start until there was an Indigenous youth leader to take the mantle of a champion to bring together this dialogue. And as a matter of serendipity, in late summer of 2022, I was invited by the International Network for Government Science Advice, INGSA, Africa, to participate in a mentee-mentor program, science advice skills development program that was initiated by INGSA Africa. And I was fortunate and truly honored to have the opportunity to interact with Dr. Temitope Sogbanmu from Nigeria. Tope, as part of this mentee-mentor program on science advice skills development, saw the Global Indigenous Youth Summit as a training ground, in a sense, a good opportunity. I don't think either of us really understood the amount of effort that would be involved in creating this dialogue, global dialogue. But Tope agreed to contribute. And at the same time, I was in discussion with Sir Philip Campbell, who was at the time, he was the editor-in-chief of Springer Nature. He'd been the editor-in-chief of Nature, and then he became the editor-in-chief of Springer Nature. And Phil and I had lunch together, and at that point, he indicated that Springer Nature could provide some modest funding for the Global Indigenous Youth Summit on Climate Change. And UNITAR operates on a cost reimbursable basis. So it's not that they have resources that they can automatically allocate to these types of initiatives. They had to be supported. And so with the support from Springer Nature and the leadership from Tope, Dr. Temitope Sogbanmu from Nigeria, it was possible to really begin the discussion. So at that point, there were early calls with Sir Philip Campbell, Tope, the people from UNITAR, Rabi El Haddad, who's the director for the multilateral diplomacy program at UNITAR, Patricia De Briones, manager for the program, the multilateral diplomacy program. And we began to build it. And it was, what was remarkable was that Tope was not only a skilled leader, but she was very skilled with networking. Had been in many fellowships and contacts across the continent of Africa. And when I was invited by INCSA Africa to assist, the concept that was introduced with the Science Advice Skills Development Program was the continent. That it wasn't just for an individual per se, but it was capacity building for the continent. And what I found remarkable in that concept of the continent was a sense of unity that existed on a continental level. And what Tope brought to the table immediately was collection, collaboration, contact with individuals in North, East, West, South, and Central Africa. And within a matter of weeks, Tope had assembled an initial steering committee of Global Indigenous Youth Summit leaders from various regions of Africa. And then from there, it began to move to other continents. So the observation in imagining how to build a Global Indigenous Youth Summit, the first and most important element was that it was by, for, and among Indigenous youth. That means that the Indigenous youth leaders made the decisions about the content of the global dialogue, and they invited the participants. So for Tope and part of this mentee-mentor program, a component of training per se was to make decisions. We all make decisions, what we write, what we choose to do, and so on, but making decisions that influence other people and their actions in terms of an initiative, that's training. And so all of the Indigenous youth leaders were, in a sense, part of this exercise, this decision-making exercise. And that, for me, the real joy in all of this was empowering to enable the Indigenous youth from around the world to create something that was their own, that they could develop into the future. And so the simple mechanism that was involved was, rather than trying to identify many individuals for me to go out and say, here, there's this possibility of a Global Indigenous Youth Summit. The idea was to have a group of Indigenous leaders, youth leaders from around the world, who effectively became nodes, distribution channels they identified their networks from the regions they were working in. The regions that they would be working in, the youth perspectives would become part of the agenda. So interacting at many regions around the world made sense to engage the perspectives and insights, cultural heritage from around the world. It was the networking that made the Indigenous Youth Summit possible. And the Indigenous youth leaders, we had discussions on a regular basis. Steering committee per se was created with the Indigenous youth leaders from around the world and the various partners. There were many partners, more than 24 partners from around the world that were contributing in various ways to the development of this global dialogue, virtual dialogue by, for, and among Indigenous youth with global inclusion. They included organizations like the United Nations Technology Bank for Least Developed Countries, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Malaysian Development Bank, as well as Springer Nature and universities and young academies from around the world. And that process just evolved, and it was inclusive, the whole thing. And it was because of Tobey's leadership that the spirit of inclusion was part of the table. And it wasn't with a specific objective in mind per se. It was simply to create a dialogue with Indigenous youth around the world, recognizing there were severe challenges to have anybody talk on a planetary scale. I mean, all the different languages. In Nigeria alone, where Tobey comes from, there's more than 500 languages. And each language, in a sense, is representative of a culture. 500 cultures in one country. And many of them are, clearly, by any stretch, indigenous cultures. So the dialogue began, the communications began, and in parallel, recognizing that a dialogue, a discussion is ephemeral. It comes and it goes, and the people that were involved have the opportunity to cherish what was said. But unless there's something beyond that, it just disappears. And so a component that was brought into the discussion very early was the idea of some type of legacy from the Global Indigenous Youth Summit on Climate Change. And the legacy was, and is, and will be, the invited commentary from nature. So nature reached out to Tobey as the point of contact, and Tobey engaged a group of Indigenous youth leaders from this dialogue, I think you were among them, to craft a commentary in nature that was Indigenous youth must be at the forefront of climate diplomacy, was the title of the paper that came out in August 2023, 3 days before the summit on the 9th of August, which is another feature that was part of the planning. And I would say as a general observation, not just for the Global Indigenous Youth Summit, but for any meeting, big or small, the timing of the meeting makes a huge difference. The timing of the meeting can create momentum or be disruptive. And so the timing of the Global Indigenous Youth Summit was time to be on the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which is the 9th of August every year by designation of the United Nations since the 1990s. And so there was a synergy that was imagined to have the Global Indigenous Youth Summit on the 9th of August. The stake was put in the ground in terms of the timing, and we could build around that. And at the same time, there were other efforts afoot within the United Nations. The United Nations International Decade on Indigenous Languages started in 2022. And so there were a number of synergies that were at play at an international level that we could build into, we could contribute. And so that's really part of the journey were those elements. So I was, I am still delighted by the leadership that came from Tope and from all of the Indigenous youth leaders around the world, in particular, because without exception, there was a spirit of inclusion. It was who, what, when, where, why, and how. It was open-minded. It wasn't restricted. It wasn't trying to control. It was open. So it's a global Indigenous Youth Summit on climate change, but Tope and others invited elders. Well, they're not youth, to participate, but elders are part of the dialogue. And so that sense of inclusion was broader than the core focus of the group. And this notion of ephemeral and legacy, they juxtaposed literally in terms of words. Something that's ephemeral disappears and something that's legacy has some permanence to it. And the idea was to capture a sense of passion. If you can bottle up passion, if you can bottle up magic and put it into a way that can be shared, that was the challenge. And I didn't participate in the writing and crafting of the invited commentary in Nature, but among the contributions that emerged from the Nature piece was the notion of a global partnership of Indigenous youth. So clearly, climate action, Sustainable Development Goal number 13, is prominent in the world in terms of discussion. Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, they're aspirational for humanity. They don't end in 2030 per se. Targets and indicators can measure progress, but these are goals that we have forever. Climate on Earth is going to be dynamic. It doesn't stop. It's changing constantly. And we as a world of humans and species of rocks and fish and everything else have challenge of responding to continuously changing climate, which operates on a planetary scale. On Earth, on Mars, and Venus, and Jupiter, all the planets in our solar system that have atmospheres have climates. And so the challenge was to take something from the summit and to carry it forward to an imagination. And the imagination that came out of the commentary among the various contributions, and it's a beautiful piece in terms of the various contributions where the Indigenous youth are sharing expertise that has emerged through generations in their various cultures about how to respond to change, environmental change. It doesn't need to be called climate because for the purposes of something local, it's whatever's around you. It's the rivers running, or the water falling or not falling. It's, the bugs that are around, it's everything. How do communities respond to these changes? And Indigenous communities have been resilient for thousands of years in the face of these changes, local environmental changes. And so the dialogue that was produced in the paper captured to some extent the experience, the wisdom of Indigenous communities in how they respond to change. And that's important because it's not just the big technology components of the world that are necessary to respond to climate. It's all of the ideas. And to that extent, the Indigenous youth were absolutely 100% correct in saying Indigenous youth must be at the forefront of climate diplomacy. There are lessons and there's wisdom to be shared from the cultures that have lived and changed and responded with resilience to climate dynamics over millennia. And that was shared in the commentary. The other observation, the concept of a global partnership of Indigenous youth, that's specifically Sustainable Development Goal number 17 about global partnerships. How do you create a global partnership? What does it look like? Who's going to be involved with a global partnership? I mean, clearly, there are groups of people that one can imagine would fit into a global partnership, but how do you create a global partnership? So the fact that the Indigenous youth leaders in this dialogue thought to specifically talk about a global partnership of Indigenous youth put in front of the world. Nature's a very well-read journal. Put in front of the world the notion of a global partnership of Indigenous youth. Challenge, and I would say the responsibility we all have now, is to support that partnership, support the development of that partnership, to support its contribution in perpetuity, in the same way that the Indigenous cultures have been resilient in the face of climate change over millennia. The responsibility now is to carry that forward, and where the Indigenous youth operate with generational understanding as a gift, really, with leadership to the rest of the world. And it's interesting in the sense of the word sustainable development, phrase sustainable development, an explicit component of sustainable development, however it's defined, is generations. However it's defined, whether it's fish in terms of the population dynamics and optimum sustainable yield or maximum sustainable yield, the concept of generations is explicit with sustainable development. How are we as a world going to operate across generations, particularly in a world that is consumed with short-sighted thinking in terms of self-interests? Well, to my mind, and the reason that I was passionate and remain passionate about assisting, coordinating to the best of my ability, with respect that the decisions are by, for, and among Indigenous youth, is a sense of operating across generations. I imagine that message about how to operate across generations can be voiced most clearly from Indigenous communities, cultures around the world. And I would say, as a beacon of hope for all humanity, that this sense of culture, of generations, how to operate across generations, my grandfather, my mother, myself, my daughter, my grandson, my great-granddaughter, all of these generations, 7 generations, thinking and operating together as a whole to effectively survive in a world of change. And I imagine those messages come most clearly from Indigenous communities. So it requires patience, in a sense, to listen and to enable those dialogues to mature, particularly when languages are complicated. There are many languages and perspectives, but the ideas and the wisdom, and the stories, and the insights about how to be resilient, those can be shared. And so the summit itself took on board many ways of sharing. It wasn't just language per se in terms of spoken language. There was art, there were paintings, there was music, dance. All of those forms of communication resonate in ways that people can understand, whether they speak one language or another. And that was the intention from the very beginning. My imagination of what was introduced in Maine was a dialogue that it was open-ended. There was no specific goal per se. So the concept of ephemeral and legacy, the dialogue itself happened on the 9th of August. It happened for 24 hours on the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. It started at 0 GMT and went to 24 GMT, 24 hours on the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. And for those that participated, they were able to see and listen to the comments and the dialogues and the interactions and questions that emerged. Those are preserved as YouTube videos on the Science Diplomacy Center website. I welcome everybody to look at those. But the legacy component really was the imagination, I think, that was initiated in the commentary that was crafted by the Indigenous youth leaders. In terms of your observation about question of ephemeral and legacy. It wasn't predicted, and it certainly wasn't anticipated. In fact, it was quite a surprise. But the outcome of the science of the Global Indigenous Youth Summit itself involved more than 1,300 registrants from more than 112 nations across more than 88 languages. And so that level of interest and engagement wasn't something that could be pursued per se. It was an outcome, a natural outcome of the leadership of the global Indigenous youth around the world. And that outcome was a clear and loud demonstration of success, that there was important consideration with the global dialogue of Indigenous youth, and it's underway. And there is now discussion about continuing the Global Indigenous Youth Summit in 2024. There's now a discussion about a book that would be possibly included in the Informed Decision Making for Sustainability book series produced by Springer that would come from the Indigenous youth leaders. So this question of ephemeral and legacy, in a sense, the Indigenous youth are creating their legacy. And, the sense of responsibility is there will be another generation of Indigenous youth following in the future. And to that, all of us on Earth, all 8 billion of us, have a sense of responsibility to assist in this global partnership of Indigenous youth. As an observation, I certainly would like to congratulate leadership from the International Arctic Science Committee in hosting this podcast series, and look forward to the leadership from IASC is in the ICARP 4 process, the International Research Program, the 4th one that will go from 2025 to 2035, and in the process, the 5th International Polar Year that will occur in 2032 to 2033. And so all of these elements that will happen across time into the future are part of how we will operate and survive as a world, with imagination and collaboration, partnership.